Just on 10 months ago, in August 1994, over here in the United States of America, one of their biggest local government areas, Orange County, California, went into bankruptcy. And all of a sudden, overnight, there was no money to pay school teachers or to pay the fire service or to do government contracts. The thing had closed down. Billions of dollars were out of existence. So the Supreme Court of California issued an injunction that no bank or any other institution that held securities on Orange County, California, could sell them until they had had an inquiry to find out what had happened. They might just as well have saved their breath, because within hours, banks were flogging those securities for anything they could get, trying to get at least perhaps half back or a quarter back, and the court was just totally ignored. And they're still trying to unravel what happened in Orange County, California. They've discovered that a lot of the money was missing through gambling on the what they call the derivatives market, and the chief executive officer of that area was mainly responsible. So finally they've had to pump some cash in from the Federal Reserve Bank to try and keep Orange County, California going. Now, we're not talking about a little council, we're talking about an area bigger than Tasmania. In the same California where that took place in August, 2 years ago, they had the whole state ran out of money. It wasn't actually formally bankrupt, but it had no cash at all. So if you worked for that government, or you had a contract or something, what happened was you got your pay or your finance in an envelope which was just in the form of an IOU from the Californian government until they had enough money to cash it again. And that meant you picked up your envelope, I owe you $540, Californian government, and people went down to the bank and they said to the bank, this is government guaranteed, can you please let us have some cash? And then invariably the bank charged them interest on that until it came good again, and then finally the banks jacked up because they weren't too sure if the money was going to come through or not. So as soon as that happened, a new market started in IOUs, and it was like a futures market. And if you had a bundle of these things, let's say $5,000 worth, you went down to the local supermarket and you said to the manager of the supermarket, look, I've got $5,000 worth of these things, can you give me, say, $3,000 worth of groceries and take a punt on it? And he was now scratching his head. He wasn't too sure whether to trust these things or not. He might make a killing or he might lose out. So this market in IOUs began to waver up and down, and finally, when it had reached the stage they had to pump some more created money in from the Federal Reserve, there were $2.3 billion worth of IOUs floating around California that had to be redeemed. Now that Orange County thing happened last August. Round about November, the news came through that this economy down here, Mexico, had gone into bankruptcy. We weren't told in the news flashes it was the third time they've gone bankrupt since 1982. And this was much worse than anything they'd had before. Let me give you a picture. 1982, when Mexico went bankrupt, it had debts of $80 billion. In 1994, when they went bankrupt, just the repayments were $80 billion, not the total debt. It was much higher than that. So the United States President Clinton announced publicly that a rescue package would be put together to try and get Mexico out of this mess, because if they didn't do it, the whole world financial system was in trouble. Mexican securities, like other third world country securities, were held by banks right throughout the world. There was panic going on in Europe and in the United States about whether the Mexican money system would collapse. Within hours of that bankruptcy, 250,000 Mexicans were thrown out of work onto the unemployment queue, and inflation went to 200%, and interest rates went to 90% per month, not per year, per month. How lucky we are in Australia. Now, what happened was the banks in Wall Street said, yes, we'll stitch together another rescue package to lend to Mexico so they can use that money to repay what they borrowed previously. But we want a guarantee, which is that if Mexico can't pay, the American taxpayers will pick up the tab. And they've done this a number of times before, and Americans are getting more and more annoyed about having to underwrite loans for banks to third world or any other country for that matter. So this time there was a mass campaign of Americans right across the country writing to senators and congressmen saying, we're not going to underwrite this loan. When it comes down to it, it's my little business. It's my family, it's my farm, and we're not going to do it. So President Clinton put the bill before Congress, which turned it down for the first time in a long period. And he was left really high and dry because he'd already made a worldwide announcement they were going to rescue Mexico. So he went to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and said, can we borrow enough money and can we stitch this up together to get Mexico out of trouble? My own people in America have jacked up on the deal. So they put up $20 billion, and then they went to all the central banks around Europe and Asia and tried to get enough together, and they came up with round about $50 billion, which was pumped into Mexico simply to repay money they'd owed previously. And the Mexican economy is staggering back, but the disruption inside is so great that whether it hangs together or not, I don't know, and it'll be back in the same boat within, what, a year or 2 years or 3 years, the way things are going at the present time. But there was one price they were forced to pay for that rescue package, which is the ultimate. They had to hand over the total oil revenues and industry of Mexico to the bankers who stitched together the loan, which is the biggest mechanism they've got to repay money, and now they're left with an ever-increasing loan, ever-increasing interest, and the industries they need to repay that loan have been cut away and taken over by the lenders. They haven't got a dog's chance. And the same is now happening in where the panic has spilled across into Brazil and also into the Argentine, and there's a whole series of third world countries who have been crippled by impossible debt, and they haven't got the means to repay it. That was then followed, as we moved towards the end of the year, right over here in our part of the world, by a financial crisis in New Guinea. New Guinea had run out of money, they couldn't balance the books, they couldn't meet external debt payments, and could something be done? So into New Guinea comes the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to try and work out a policy to stitch New Guinea together, and out came the Financial Review. There was the headline, Papua New Guinea's $6 billion crisis worsens, 30th of December 1994. Could we find some people who would raise money to pump into New Guinea to keep them going? And of course, just south of New Guinea is the big rich uncle called Australia. So it wasn't very long ago that Sir Julius Chan and Prime Minister Keating met in Cairns to work together a financial aid package for New Guinea, on the condition that they accepted the rigid, tough conditions of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And of course, the generous Australian people who have no financial problems would provide the money to keep New Guinea going. That was December 1994. That was then followed by the news a little bit later on, 1995 now, that the biggest engineering project carried out probably this century in Europe, which was the building of the tunnel under the Channel from England to France, is now virtually bankrupt. It was only opened last year. It cost billions of dollars. It was built by a private consortium. The first 12 months it lost $700 million. And the consortium says we can't afford to keep it open. It's a magnificent thing, but of course, if it's not financial, how do you operate? Would the governments use tax money to buy it back and make it public? In other words, the privatized thing is now reversing over that particular deal. And of course, England and France won't be in it because they've got big financial problems themselves. Over here in France, one of their biggest banks, Credit Lyonnais, is just about at the point of going into receivership. Over in England, they've just lost the oldest bank in the country, Barings Bank, and you probably read the story of that. The real story is an absolute classic, because Barings Bank, which has been there for over 200 years, instructed one of their young employees down in Malaysia to start gambling on the derivatives market. Now, what is this thing called the derivatives market? Most producers know something about the futures market. You have futures market in sugar, or in wool, or in copper, or in metals, or various commodities, and you're gambling on what the price is going to be in 9 months' time when you sell. But the derivatives market is not even gambling in commodities. It's gambling on whether an interest rate in Japan will go up or down, or whether the exchange rate in Chile will go up or down, and people are punting huge volumes of money. Here in Australia now, we are transacting through the banks round about $200 billion worth of transactions every 24 hours. And it's estimated 40% of that is going on the derivatives market, which just in Australia's case now is over $2 trillion. Trillion, not billion, trillion. Anyhow, Nicholas Leeson down in Malaya was gambling on the derivatives market. And it was a pretty good punt because the Japanese yen was going up and they were just betting on the Japanese yen, and they might have made a killing except for one thing. They had an earthquake in Kobe, which plunged Japan into a very, very short recession, and down went the yen far enough to sink Barings Bank. So Barings Bank became the big issue, and young Nicholas Leeson, who was on holiday in Malaya, suddenly discovered when he looked at the television that he was now wanted for crime in Singapore. So away he goes to Frankfurt and was arrested there and is now in jail, and they don't know where they're going to try him. It's not him who should be tried, it's the directors of the bank back at home who directed this policy. And you get some classics coming out about this. The Bulletin did an article on what had happened in Barings. Collapsed, taken over by a Dutch group, and this is what it says. Barings, proudly British since Captain Cook, fell under the control of the Dutch ING group. Their first priority was to reassure the executives that their Christmas bonuses totaling $200 million would still be paid. They had to be properly rewarded, you see, after a year in which the bank lost $1.5 billion. Another bank, Deutsche Bank, looked even sillier when it sued Barings for $47 million the day after Barings had collapsed. The big winners were the London newspapers, which had a field day printing Barings jokes. The Independent ran a Lose Your Barings competition. The Reader, who devised an Asian portfolio that lost the most money, won a holiday in Singapore, including a stopover in Frankfurt, where the young guy's in jail. It's become a total farce. That was then followed shortly afterwards by a bill that went before the United States Congress, put up by the Republican Party, that they should simply balance their budget by the year 2001. In other words, the simplest thing, they're not to spend more than they bring in taxes, and they got 6 years to get the book straight. And do you know that that bill was defeated because they reckoned it would cause so much pain in America that it would become politically unstable? They've had to resubmit it, and it got through by 2 votes, but the evidence is that they're not going to be able to do it, and I'll show you why. Over here in Washington, the capital of America, they've now got one central debt of $5.5 trillion. Now, people don't know what trillion means. They're not too sure what billion means, let alone little figures. Let's give you a picture. If you went into your bank and you picked up $1 million in cash, and you said you wanted it in $100 bills, that pile you got would be about 9 or 10 inches thick. You could carry it away and hope nobody saw you do it. But you ask for $1 trillion in $100 bills, and that same stack will be 6 kilometers high. That's the difference between 1 million and 1 trillion. Now you take this 6 kilometer stack of $100 bills and multiply it by 5.5, and you're up to about 32 kilometers high in $100 bills. Up through the hole in the ozone layer and out into outer space and flying saucers and cosmic dust and telecom sending messages around the world, all that. And that is the bill that Washington's got. It's not the state's debts or business debts or private debts or mortgage debts or those sort of debts. It's just one government debt. The total debt of America now is coming up towards 20 trillion. Now, bad enough as it is, they're being told the most ghastly lie about how they're going to solve it. The American people who know the country is going into bankruptcy are being told this: we can get out of this by getting leaner and meaner and more efficient and more competitive. And if we produce more stuff and sell it overseas, there's this great swag of money in other countries we'll bring back into America, and that'll pay this 32 kilometer high debt off in $100 bills. So, quite honestly, if America had the chance of landing Kane in Mackay tomorrow, they would do it, because they need Mackay dollars back into the United States to pay their debt off. If they could sell wool down in New England, or wheat on the Darling Downs, or coal to Newcastle, or copper to Mount Isa, they would do it. They need Australian dollars to help them pay their debt off. Now, the futility of this is that they are building now into every nation a compulsion that says the only way you're going to survive is you've got to export more and more stuff, you've got to get leaner and meaner and cut your profits and cut your wages. And the whole thing is a con once you start looking at the world as a picture. We've got America now opening up a trade war with Japan because Japan won't buy American cars. Japan needs American cars like a hole in the head. They're the biggest car manufacturer the world has ever seen. They're piling up in Japan and they're losing markets themselves. The American cars are too big and unwieldy. You might stick the Prince of Japan in one, but you wouldn't stick anybody else in it because they don't fit on Japanese roads. But now they are subject of world sanctions because they won't buy American cars. That's not fair. They should buy them, according to President Clinton. Now, if you've got a situation where the whole world now is in debt, and we all are in debt, every country, even the Arabian countries that sell oil, are deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. Britain is chronically in debt. So is Europe. Russia is a cot case. And so are all these nations. And you're telling each one of these you can pay your debt off by exporting stuff somewhere else. Where do you end up with this thing? I mean, I've got nothing against exports so long as we get back what we really want. But look at the message of a Canadian economist by the name of Professor Naylor at McGill University, who said in a book that he's published not long ago, we were able at our university to put the whole course of world trade onto a computer. We've never been able to do this before. And we had this theory that trade simply balanced out, and if one nation had a credit, another one would have a debt. But he said, we put every export, every import, every trade deal, every check, every payment, every cross credit onto a computer, and then we got a picture out which told us the impossible. The world as a whole is now running a huge trade deficit with itself every 12 months. And he said in that one program out of the computer, it blew every economic theory that we've got out of the water, because we've taught it balanced, and here it didn't. So he said, in confusion, we wrote to the International Monetary Fund and asked the question, can you explain what's going on? And they said, we are aware of this growing, ever-growing world debt that can't be paid, but there's no logical explanation at the moment. They did this in the usual bureaucratic jargon. So every year we put it in our world figures of the economy under the heading asymmetries, which is a lovely word you need to remember, because if anybody ever asks you a question saying, what about this or what about that, and you don't know what the answer is, you say, well, of course that comes under the heading of asymmetries. And they walk away thinking, what a genius you are. What it really means is nobody knows what the answer is. Now, there is a logical and obviously beneficial side to world trade. Nations send out stuff they've got surpluses of and bring in what they don't produce themselves. But if you have put an artificial thing onto that that says to every nation you've got to cut into new export markets and export more than you're importing, and that's the only way you can get out of debt, and you're doing this in a world situation where every nation is going deeper into debt, you've got the ingredients for a trade war like we've never seen. And that is half the reason for the economic breakdown, and incidentally, for a lot of the environmental damage we're doing. You have put people under a pressure that is forcing them to destroy themselves in the end, not for logical trade, but simply to satisfy bankers who are creating more and more debt money at higher and higher interest and putting every nation into bondage. So that's the picture now around the world of what is happening. All around the world now, the whole financial system is tottering under this debt thing. Let me try and give you a few pictures about Australia first of all. We've just had a budget brought down in May of this, just a couple of weeks ago. We had the usual statement on television. We had the newspaper pundits cutting it all apart and analyzing it. And yet again, at every meeting that I've gone to, I've asked people this simple question. Do you know what the average Australian pays in tax to Canberra? Is there anybody here knows? One person. Good on you. Now, it's the first hand I've ever seen go up. Let me try and give you a picture of where this has gone. When Willis brought his first budget down in 1994, we're now talking about just a fraction over 12 months ago, for the first time ever, all the money coming into Canberra in the form of taxes went over 100 billion bucks. And if you wanted to average that out across the people, it came to a fraction over $6,000 for every individual. That's from a little baby that big to the oldest person in the community. $6,000 on average in tax to Canberra. Not state taxes, not local government rates, just Canberra's share. For a mother and father and two kids, that's an average 24,000 bucks. It's a little bit more, 24,500 bucks. 12 months later, the budget that he brought down, which we've just heard, lifted the average tax per person from just over $6,000 to $7,000 per head. In one 12-month period, our tax went up by $1,000, or let's say $900, which is about the approximate figure for every Australian, which is close to, what, 3,600 bucks for every family. The average Australian mother, father, and 2 kids are now paying 28,000 bucks to just keep Canberra out of trouble. And they get a lot of that back, or some of that back, in social securities and other programs which are very badly spent. That's my own opinion. We'd do much better if we kept the money in our pocket, or part of it, and spent it ourselves. A growing proportion of that is going as interest on debt. And for every living person in this country, we now spend $1,000 just paying interest on debts that our different governments have borrowed, the local council or the state debt or the federal debt, and that is rising rapidly. Now, for a long period, we've been running deficit budgets. In other words, all the tax money comes in, it's not enough for what they want to do, so they borrow some more money, which is just created out of nothing by the Reserve Bank and then tacked onto the foreign debt in the end, onto the national debt, and they spend that. But this year, there was a great blare of trumpets. We haven't got a deficit, because they've now opted for the other choice, which is you flog bigger and bigger and bigger bits of Australia. And so they flog the rest of the Commonwealth Bank, which we started out with to stop this ever happening. And then they flogged the whole fleet of Commonwealth cars of 18,000 vehicles, and then forgot to cost into the expenditure the money they were now going to need to rent cars back from the people who they'd flogged it to. That was completely omitted from the budget expenditure figures. So they're all presumably going to go around on bicycles, which we've hired from somebody other. The real truth is that we are one of the most overtaxed nations in the world. Second question is, was that budget made in Australia? And my opinion is it was not. Because the night after the budget, Time magazine came out and gave a picture of what was happening, and this is what they said. Australian Treasurer Ralph Willis was making last-minute changes to the federal budget. The media was preparing for their usual blanket coverage. These days, they may be looking in the wrong place. Increasingly, the decisions that dictate Australia's ways and means are not made in the parliaments of Australia, but in the boardrooms and markets of the world. Says Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett, Australia is but a drop of water in the overall scheme of things. Foreign investors now control 40% of Australia's $114 billion bond market, setting the interest rates businesses and governments must pay on their loans. Investment decisions that make or break Australian jobs and hopes are often made by faraway executives looking at a world map, not Australia's interests. Time magazine, it's an accurate summary. The decisions are increasingly made outside this country. About a few years ago, Paul Keating, just after they got in, the Hawke-Keating government got in, announced we were now going to go for deregulation. This was the way to get better. The banks would compete, and we would have cheaper interest rates, and this would open up Australia to the world economy. And the guy who was put in charge of that deregulation is a man by the name of Mr. Fred Argy, who is now writing articles saying that it's been pretty detrimental to what Australia is actually suffering. And he did he's now coming under attack himself. He did a major feature article in the Financial Review in the middle of April in which he says it has produced a number of things. What Campbell and others failed to foresee fully was that deregulation would increase enormously the role and influence of financial markets in social and economic policy, that this would impose a major constraint on the ability of governments to implement, through tax and transfer policies, the community's preferred set of social priorities. Political agendas are being increasingly dictated by what the big players in financial markets, mainly international funds managers, want. This applies especially to an indebted country like Australia. In that indirect sense, deregulation has undoubtedly been a regressive influence. This is the guy who set it in motion. Now Australia's decisions are being made from outside this country and not by our parliaments. That is obvious. So the end result is something like this. Since deregulation started, we have wiped out 150,000 farmers in this country. We started that mad track with a statement by Doug Anthony, of all people, get big or get out. Do you remember that when it first came out? And the argument was get rid of 10% of the little uneconomic producers and we would have happiness and wealth for all the remainder. We had 270,000 farmers then. 10% would have brought us down to about 250. We're down to 100,000 farmers left now, and they're still going off by, what, 118 every week at the present time. But now it has shifted past farmers onto small business. Small business is the one copying it. 185 going out of business every 7 days in Australia at the present time. How come that's not played out on the news or in the budget? So really we're handing this country over out of the hands of the traditional Australians who own their farms and their businesses and their jobs to more and more international control. And as we do this, we're producing bigger and bigger chaos. Now, let's just have a look at some of the facts. This is the degree of foreign ownership going on in Australia at the present time. Over a 20-year period, foreign interests now own most of Australia's enterprise. The levels of foreign ownership are processed food 95%, motor vehicles 100%, chemicals 98%, pharmaceuticals 100%, mining 97%, electrical 98%, banking 86%, confectionery and beverages 84%, manufacturing 57%, insurance 82%, building materials 88%, hotels 75%, and oil and gas 92%. These used to belong to us. They're not new industries come in. They are industries that Australians built and which we have sold off to overseas ownership to try and hide the fact that we're going deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And now we're selling all our assets. We sell our banks and our airlines and our electricity commissions and our water commissions. The Sydney Water now is owned by 2 French companies. Adelaide has just advertised the new ownership of Adelaide's water supply, and in the advertisement it stated that no Australian company need apply. This is in our country. We are just building the last major railway in Australia from Darwin down to Alice Springs. We built the Transcontinental Railway right in the first part of this century. It was done easily by Australians. We've got the know-how, we've got the materials. Who's got this job? Not Australians. The contract's gone to Korea. And the result of this is now that we're wrecking more and more families and more lives. The unemployment queue comes down to about 9%, and everybody has a party because it's so good. It's not good, it's a disaster. 800,000 or 900,000 Australians without jobs, and on top of that now we're hiding the figures because they keep cutting out. You know, if you only got to have a job for 2 weeks and they cut you for two hours and they cut you off the figures now. If you happen to go in hospital at a time you're unemployed and you haven't been along to apply for a job, they cut you off the figures. They're trying to hide what's going on. The real figures are closer to 20% than down to 10. They don't tell us the truth on these things. So as we wreck more and more Australian families, these are the sort of results. We now have 680,000 kids in Australia living in homes where nobody has an income-producing job. We've got 25,000 Australian kids who are homeless. About 280,000 Australians wait on waiting lists for homes which we could build easily if you let the building industry really go and stop building government apartments instead. And then finally, the figure is 2/3 of the Australian people now owe more than they actually earn. Not 10%, not 20%, 2/3 owe more than they actually own. I don't think our governments have got terribly much to be proud of. The result of this is now that there is a pressure on Australians to accept lower and lower and lower standards if we've got to become competitive, and we've got to compete, so we're told, against Southeast Asia. Now let me give you some of the personal stories that are coming out of this. It wasn't very long ago. Did anybody see a George Negus program, Foreign Correspondent, not very long ago, on carpet making? Anybody see that? Now the story is this. Right through Australia now we've got Persian carpets being sold. Beautiful carpets. They really are magnificent. But the camera went to where they were being manufactured, and it did a story. And there you saw kids of 4 and 5 and 6 years old actually chained with metal chains to the looms that they were working on, working 16 hours a day for no money at all. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. One little boy managed to escape from one of these factories, and they took him across to the United Nations, and they made a major feature on what he'd gone through and turned him into a world celebrity, and all the cameras were on him. And then they take this poor kid who'd given all this information and dump him back where he'd lived in the carpet making business, and he was shot to death in a week. They just blasted him away with a shotgun. Now, what's that got to do with Australia? I want to tell you what it's got to do with this country. Last time I was down in Melbourne, I spoke in one of the suburbs called Coburg, which has hundreds of little factories. This is clothing and textiles and shoes. And the mayor of Coburg happened to chair the meeting, and she was telling me about this. She said, it's very interesting in this suburb. We have the factories open at 9 or 8:30 in the morning and work through till the normal hours, all closed down, and then at 10 o'clock at night they all come alight again and they start operating. But this time a separate labor force has come in of illegal immigrants and people who can't get jobs, and they're working in those conditions for under $2 an hour. And it is a form of slave labor coming in. And I thought, oh, come on, that's a bit of an exaggeration. That wouldn't happen in Australia. It might happen in the third world. She said, it's true. I said, wouldn't the trade unions stop it and the police get onto it and the politicians jump up and down? She said, they all know. And I came back home and I was thinking about this, and there was a report in the Sunday papers in Sydney. The same thing was happening in Sydney. And finally, one trade union began to investigate what was going on. And out came their report, which came out under this heading: Report exposes the rag trade slave workers. They had done an investigation. I'll give you one guess on how many people in Australia are working under those conditions. 10,000, 20,000? The figure is 300,000. 300,000 inside this country. Now, what made it staggering to me was that at the time they had that George Negus program on, we had a politician came out and said, look, we shouldn't stop buying carpets, because if we stop buying carpets, it would make it even worse for those kids. How much worse it could get, I cannot think, but nevertheless. But why aren't the politicians dealing with that issue? Because under that slave labor now happening in Australia, ordinary Australians are just thrown out onto the work queue. So then out came the Australian that did a feature article on who is buying their products from that slave labor situation. This is what it said. In its investigation of the industry, the Textile Clothing and Footwear Union of Australia has found that outworkers paid about a third of the award rate are making expensive designer clothes, which sell in many cases in many of the country's leading retailers. Companies as high profile as Jag, Perry Cutter, Laura Ashley, Ken Dunstan Art and Design, George Gross, Anthea Crawford, Adidas and Country Road are getting their clothes made in those subhuman slave labor factories inside this country. Inside this country. We've got some real problems if we don't wake up and do something about it. So I want to try and give you a picture now about how our politicians reckon this could be solved. Can you all see that map? You all know it anyhow, or most people know it. It's the map of Australia, and it's the traditional map we've had right through our century, through this century. And of course, I find even amongst young people, they all recognize that, because it's part of the culture in which we live, quite obviously. And then you say to them, what are these lines in the middle? And I've met a few who aren't too sure, because we don't get this stuff taught in school these days, or in some schools. There are obviously the state boundaries between the various states, and we've divided this into a federation: Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and the Northern Territory. And everybody understands this because it's built into the culture. How could you live in Queensland without knowing that we have in this state at the present time not only the Sheffield Shield, but the state of origin? It's part of the way we play. What a tremendous game it was, too. And then you say to people, now how did we get these lines drawn in Australia? And now the question mark starts. And I've had some have said to me, well, of course, that happened back at the time of Captain Cook. He came in and we sort of divided Australia up. The truth of the matter is that it was nearly 100 years after Captain Cook this began to happen. We had a little settlement at Botany Bay. We had one up at Moreton Bay. We had a group down in Tasmania, one or two in Victoria, a little settlement here in Western Australia. And their biggest job was getting enough to eat, let alone cut the country into a federation. But by the middle of the 1800s, those state boundaries had been marked out on foot by surveyors, and we had the federation. And before we ever had this red dot, which is Canberra, we had a capital city in each state, And the best buildings, if you go down to Brisbane, were built before Federation. We'd done a lot of work. We had railways in place. We had post and telegraphs. We had Cobb & Co. operating. We were producing wool. The sugar industry was in place and was producing prodigiously. And it was reckoned that in 1900, Australia had the highest standard of living in the world. And then somebody had this idea, should we have a national government? Because each state had its own government with its own constitution and its own flag. And we could have developed like that as separate countries with a close affinity. But somebody said, why don't we have a central government? There are a few things could be easily done this way. People didn't like that. Once you get central governments, they tax you more and more money, and then they want more and more power and more control over you, and then they become dictatorial. But there was another argument that said, well, look, if we don't do this, we're going to have problems. Are we going to have a separate army, navy, and air force for each state? Or are we going to have separate money systems for each state, or different postage stamps? Or what about foreign affairs? Is every state going to have an embassy overseas and trade works and all the rest of it? Why not have a national government just to deal with a few matters, and then we'll keep the rest of it like it is? So after a lot of argument, the Australian people decided to have a central government to look after a limited number of things, but they were scared stiff that they were going to become too powerful. So they came up with this document, the Australian Constitution, which most people have never seen or heard of. I'm sorry to tell you this, but it's true. It's the most important legal document in the country. It's the title deeds to Australia. Because under this, we laid out the laws to say to Canberra, now look, Canberra, you can't just do anything you want, and don't think you can get into power and change this constitution, because it cannot be changed now without asking the people. And the last clause of this constitution says, no change to the constitution unless the people have been asked in a referendum, and all the Australian adult population can have a say about the changes. Now, how come we're getting all the changes that we're getting now without referendums? So from that position where Australia had the highest standard per capita living in the world, we have gone gradually downwards to the point where we're now an indebted cot case. And I want to show you a map now of the new map of Australia, if we can get this round. Can you all see that roughly? Anybody seen this map before? This is an official government map produced by Paul Keating, and he paid a task force to get this map into place. It's called the Kelty Task Force. The head of the task force was Bill Kelty of the ACTU, and he was given enough money to go around Australia and write a new map of how Australia is going to be as we move towards the 20th century. And you will see instead, although we've still got the state lines here, you will see a whole lot of red lines. And those red lines are the new regions they're setting up in Australia. And the program is originally designed by Whitlam. We will amalgamate councils together, and we will regionalise them into regional governments, and we will start funding them direct from Canberra. Have they got the right to do this? No. Because the Constitution says local government is nothing to do with Canberra, and we've had 2 referendums about that question, and the people have said no, both times when Canberra wanted to get its sticky beak into local government. Now they're going ahead whatever the people think and whether you like it or not, because they say we've got the money, and if you don't do what we want, we'll just cut the money off anyhow. So they're forcing regions to come into existence around Australia, and you will notice if you look at this carefully that the regions actually cross state boundaries. Here's one that runs from South Australia into Victoria and New South Wales. Here's another one that runs from, say, Narrabri in New South Wales right up through the Darling Downs to Roma and Injune. They're deliberately designed to cut across the boundaries. Why? Because the theory is this. Once we get these regions into place, they will be funded direct from Canberra, and the money that goes to each region as it's set up will be cut away from the state governments we've had in the past. So over a period of time, the state governments get weaker and weaker and weaker and finally go out of existence, and we'll have a whole number of regions under Canberra's control in place. Does that mean we're now going to have elections for each region to put our representatives in there? No. We're being conditioned to accept the idea that the people who run these regions will, for the most part, not be elected representatives at all. They'll be appointed. And they'll appoint them from different organizations. There might be one from the Chamber of Commerce, and one from the cane growers, and one from the Greenie movement, and one from the feminist movement, and one from Social Security, and a couple of departmental people, and they will simply be handed the money, and the people will be told what they get. There is no recourse if you reckon your money is being misspent. That's the program. So these regions are now on the map. And people say, but this is all theory. No, it's not. 19 are already in place. No referendum to ask if that's what the people want. It's just going to be done whether you like it or not. Well, in some cases, some of the councillors who do take this thing responsibly say, no, look, we are representatives of people. We were elected into the local council. We don't think we should go ahead with this until the people have been asked. And the response from Canberra is this: all right, you don't have to be in it, but there's no money if you don't. So you either go bankrupt or you obey the orders of the central government. And that's the program at the moment, and it's just steadily being put in. Now, we had Wayne Goss, who is in the same Labour Party as Keating, announced not very long ago that if this went on, Queensland would go out of existence. Richard Court, Premier of Western Australia, has said he is very, very concerned about the total destruction of the Federation without ever the people being consulted or asked whether that's what they want or not. And that's where we are. But that's not the end of it, because on top of this program, supposed to start in about 3 weeks' time, on July the 1st, we have a new compulsory competition policy coming in. It's called the National Competition Policy, produced in a report called the Hilmer Report. How many people have heard of the Hilmer Report? Anybody here? Well, we've got a few, thank goodness. About 6 months ago, nobody'd heard of it. What are the rules of the Hilmer Report? Hilmer Report says the only way to get Australia up and running is compulsory competition, with user pays for every single thing that happens. It applies to your farm, it applies to your grocery store, it applies to your local council, it even applies probably to some charities that are collecting money or trying to run welfare or whatever it happens to be. They're going to have 2 new government commissions in Canberra, one called the Australian Competition Council and the other the National Competition Commission, that make the rules. And the rules will apply to everybody. Now let's just say it's the Mackay City Council wants to build a footpath down one of the main streets, which they've been doing for 100 years. Now what's the normal procedure? Either you get some council workers who are employed there and have jobs there, and they get the cement mixers and they do the form work, and the engineer comes along in his car and has a look to see it's going in the right direction, and the thing's done pretty quickly. Or else you go to the local ready mix people and they do the concrete and they simply come out and pour it. That's out now. From now on, every job down to a local footpath must be put out to national tender, and the cheapest tender must get the job, by law and under penalty of huge fines if this does not happen. Now, the tender for a footpath in Mackay might come from a little company in Hobart. It might come from Singapore or Fiji or the Philippines. It doesn't matter where it comes from. If it is the cheapest tender, that tender gets the job. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to dismantle the traditional structures we've got for capital works at local government level and probably state government level, and open it up to who? A number of multinationals that are waiting to take over the job and are prepared, I believe, to run at a loss to get the monopoly and then open up afterwards. By which time each council or each group or each industry has dismantled its traditional structure for doing the job itself. And if you find this difficult to believe, get the report. I've got a copy in my car. Have a look at it. Now, one brave little councillor down here in New South Wales by the name of Bevan O'Regan, who is the mayor of Narrabri, had collected all the evidence for this, and he was running around trying to get other councillors to look at it. They said, look, don't tell us about it because it's the only way we can get the money. We've got to accept this. But he said this is destroying the idea that the government is responsible to the people. Yeah, we know that, but I mean, we can't beat our head against a big brick wall. So last September he did a video which amazingly went to 1/3 of the councils in Australia. And they have now got a picture of the program that is going on. He's done a second one we've got here tonight on the Hilmer Report and the implications. If you want to see the original map set out by the Celtic Task Force under Keating's orders, just get the video council at the Crossroads. They've got the original map there. Well, I've got some photocopies here if anybody wants to get it. Now, we're not talking about 2 years' time, 3 years' time. We're talking about July the 1st of this year. What else happens on that date? Very interesting thing. On July the 1st, at the same time as we get the Hilmer Report implemented, incidentally, under these laws, any organization or private industry that disobeys the laws of the Competition Commission is up for a $10 million fine. If it's a private individual, $250,000, very generous. They've cut it down a bit. It's enough to wreck everything. Same date, Australia moves into the World Trade Organization. And has anybody heard of that? WTO? It is the latest update of GATT. How many people have heard of GATT? General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Yep, most people have heard of that. What they don't know now is that GATT has been finalized by the introduction of the third great power in the world, the WTO. We're going to have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which has been set up. They're arguing about where the final headquarters are going to be. The first leader is Mr. Ruggiero from Italy, and we're going to have a world level playing field with the same rules applying to every single nation in the world, whether it's Fiji or whether it's Mexico, which has collapsed, or whether it's Australia. And on July the 1st, Australia will be asked to pass legislation through Canberra enabling this thing to start happening. We've already signed it and ratified it. And if that legislation goes through, basically what we'll have done is deliberately hand over the decision-making process in Australia outside to a world organization for the first time ever to make our laws. Now let me try and bring this down to what it means for local people. You might have a group of primary producers, cane growers in this area, who have worked a very efficient industry for a long period of time, and they own their own mill and all the rest of it. Or you might have some manufacturers here in Mackay who are producing metal parts or components or textiles, whatever it happens to be. Or you've got a trade union looking after its workers. We've had this, and traditionally we have squabbles between them, but it's always in the Australian context. Now all of a sudden each of these different groups here in Mackay start getting new orders coming in. Here are 21 new conditions applied to grain cane. You can no longer have a total monopoly. This is only hypothesis because this actually hasn't happened yet. You've got to alter the rotation of your crops. You're going to have different marketing schemes. It's got to be open to international tender for different sorts of things. It might be out west where you can only plant certain varieties, and that in some cases you're going to have parts of your farm closed down. Incidentally, this is linked right into the United Nations environmental movement that is now producing mayhem out on farms. And some of the latest ideas are crazy. They're even talking about a $300 license fee for every dam you've got on your property now, with fines if you don't do it, and half the fine goes to the person who dobbed you in. I mean, it's Russian stuff, this stuff coming in. Now, the World Trade Organization issues these orders, so it might write to the trade union group and say, now look, there are a whole lot of new conditions applying to enterprise bargaining. It's got to be done in this way and that way. The manufacturers have got to change the specifications of their machines and their labeling and their coding, and they've got to submit to best management practices and all the rest of this, and this means it's got to come under central inspection. So all these groups, the farmers and the workers and the manufacturers, who do they naturally go to? They get hold of their federal member of parliament or the state member, and they jump up and down and do the usual act. This is ridiculous. We're all in debt. How are you going to do this to us? If you actually try and push this stuff through, it's going to wreck us. And the member of parliament, who was such a nice chap, and they're always nice people, pulls out his notebook and he starts making notes. Yes, I agree with you, and I think this is really very destructive, and I will do my best to make sure that we get this changed. And who did you say it was? And he writes all this stuff down, and everybody goes home and they think, oh, well, he's a pretty good bloke, you know, and he's probably doing his best, and they feel a little bit better off. And 3 months later, there's been no change at all. So they get on the phone to him. What's going on? And he said, well, I'm not sure. I'm still going through the legislation here in Canberra trying to find out where this came from. He's looking in the wrong place. It didn't come from Canberra. It came direct from the World Trade Organization, which has been given permission by our government to make our trade and work laws for the future without having to go through our parliaments. In other words, we have actually transferred the decision-making process out of the hands of elected representatives, out of the hands of the people, to international institutions. And that, to me, is a form, I believe it is treason. Now, if you've got any doubts about this, here's an article that came out in the Weekend Australian, May the 6th and the 7th, by one of the top bureaucrats in Australia. And the heading is, Analyst Predicts Shift to Globalism. And this is what he said: a major shift in political power from national to international levels is inevitable, according to Mr. Gary Sturgis, who was the Director General of the New South Wales Cabinet Office, who made his comments in an address to the Constitutional Centenary Foundation. It is inevitable that we're going to have a shift in decision-making out of Australia to international forums, but he went on to say it won't go all the way. boy, oh boy, it doesn't comfort me much. It's like the young lady who reckons you can have a little bit of pregnancy so long as you don't have too much. Once we start handing decision-making out of this country overseas, we've lost our democracy and our constitution and our freedom.